In the spring of 1982, a researcher named Margaret Dalton was compiling an oral history of Frank Sinatra's inner circle for the American Film Institute. She'd been at it for 6 months, interviewing former band members, arrangers, bodyguards, assistants, anyone who'd worked closely with Frank during the Capitol Records years. Margaret was thorough, obsessive, even. She cross-referenced date books, session logs, tour schedules, payroll records, building a timeline of who was where, when, and that's when she noticed something strange. There was a gap. Not in time. Frank's schedule from 1958 to 1962 was meticulously documented, but in personnel, in names, between late 1959 and early 1960, a man appeared repeatedly in expense reports, flight manifests, and hotel registries, always traveling with Frank's entourage, always listed as personal attaché or executive assistant. The accounting firm that handled Frank's finances had paid this man a salary, a good one, comparable to what Frank paid his most trusted people, but Margaret couldn't find his name anywhere else. No interviews, no memoir mentions, no photographs with captions, not even in the unofficial, off-the-record stories that veterans of Frank's world would tell after a few drinks. When Margaret asked about him, carefully, obliquely, she was met with silence, or confusion, or a quick change of subject. One former band member said, "I don't remember anyone by that name." A tour manager looked uncomfortable and said, "Some things aren't worth remembering." A longtime assistant to Frank simply shook his head and said, "If Frank wanted him forgotten, then he's forgotten. That's how it works." Margaret made notes. She kept digging, but every thread led nowhere. The man had existed. The financial records proved it. But beyond those dry accounting ledgers, he'd been completely erased from Frank Sinatra's history. Not fired publicly, not scandalized, not even acknowledged as having existed, just gone. How does a person simply vanish from the life of one of the most documented men in America? For the purposes of this story, we'll call him James. Not his real name, that's been lost or deliberately obscured, but a placeholder for the man who was there. James entered Frank Sinatra's orbit in late 1958. He was in his early 30s, well-educated, discreet, efficient. He'd come recommended by someone Frank trusted, possibly a lawyer, possibly a studio executive. The exact connection is unclear. His official title was vague: personal attaché, executive assistant, liaison. But those who worked alongside him understood what he actually did. James was a fixer, not in the crude sense, not the guy who made bodies disappear or paid off mistresses. Frank had other people for that kind of work, if such work was necessary. James was a different kind of fixer. He fixed problems before they became problems. He anticipated needs. He understood power and how to move around it quietly. When Frank was traveling and needed a meeting arranged with someone powerful, a studio head, a politician, a business partner, James made it happen. When Frank needed information about someone, James got it. When Frank needed a message delivered that couldn't be delivered through official channels, James delivered it. He was valuable because he was invisible. He didn't want attention, didn't want credit, just did the work. And most importantly, he knew things. He knew about money, about the complicated web of corporations and accounts that protected Frank's earnings, about the cash payments and the legitimate contracts and the places where those two worlds intersected. He knew about fear, about Frank's terror of being vulnerable, about the nightmares of ending up back in Hoboken, broke and forgotten, about the paranoia that came with fame. He knew about relationships, who Frank trusted, who he feared, who he loved and who he used. For 18 months, James was indispensable. He traveled with Frank, sat in on meetings, had access to private conversations, financial documents, personal correspondence. Frank trusted him, and in Frank Sinatra's world, trust was the rarest currency of all. But trust, once given, can become a liability. The exact moment is lost to history, deliberately obscured by those who were there and chose not to speak. but based on fragments from different sources, a picture emerges. It was early 1960. Frank was in Miami, preparing for a string of shows at the Fontainebleau. The Rat Pack was there, Dean, Sammy, Peter. The atmosphere was loose, celebratory. Money was flowing. Cameras were everywhere. James was in the background as always, handling logistics, making calls, ensuring everything ran smoothly. According to one account, unverifiable but consistent with the timeline, James was in Frank's suite late one night, organizing paperwork. Frank was in the next room with several associates, discussing business. The door wasn't fully closed. James heard something he wasn't supposed to hear. Not a criminal confession, not a mob meeting, nothing that would make headlines, just a conversation about money, about payments, about arrangements that existed in a gray area between legal and not quite legal. The kind of thing that was common in that world, in that era, among powerful men who operated beyond standard rules. But if that conversation became public, if someone testified about it, or wrote about it, or mentioned it to the wrong journalist, it could cause problems, investigations, questions, scrutiny. James didn't react, didn't comment, just continued organizing papers, as if he'd heard nothing. But someone noticed that he'd been in the room, that the door had been open, that he might have heard, and in Frank Sinatra's world, might have was enough, because James now represented a risk, not because he was malicious, not because he planned to betray Frank, simply because he knew, and knowledge, in the wrong moment, could become a weapon. Frank Sinatra, in early 1960, was at the peak of his power. He'd won an Oscar, his albums were selling millions, he was making movies with the Rat Pack, he was close with the Kennedys, would perform at JFK's inauguration the following year. He owned his own record label, Reprise, giving him unprecedented artistic control, but with that power came vulnerability. Frank's entire life was built on control, control over his image, control over his career, control over the narrative. He'd clawed his way back from the bottom once, the early 1950s, when his voice failed and his career collapsed, and he was never going back there. Every aspect of his public persona was carefully managed. The swagger, the confidence, the chairman of the board image, all of it was constructed, maintained, protected, and anything that threatened that construction had to be dealt with. James wasn't a threat in the traditional sense. He wasn't going to blackmail Frank, wasn't going to write a tell-all book, wasn't going to testify to investigators, but he didn't have to do any of those things to be dangerous. All he had to do was exist, as someone who knew, someone who could be called, someone who could be pressured, someone whose memory might become inconvenient. Frank's dilemma was simple but profound. How do you neutralize a risk without creating a bigger one? You couldn't fire James publicly. That would raise questions about why he was being fired. You couldn't threaten him. That would make an enemy out of someone who wasn't one yet. You couldn't ignore him. The risk would remain. So Frank did what powerful men have always done when faced with problems that can't be solved through force. He used money. The meeting happened in a lawyer's office, not Frank's primary attorney, someone more peripheral, someone whose records would be harder to trace. James was asked to attend, told it was about restructuring compensation or exploring new opportunities, the kind of vague corporate language that could mean anything. Frank wasn't there. He never was, for this kind of thing. That was the point of having people. Instead, there was a lawyer and an accountant, both polite, both professional. They presented James with an offer, a lump sum payment, substantial enough to live comfortably for years, maybe the equivalent of $200,000 in 1960 dollars, possibly more. In exchange, James would sign several documents, a non-disclosure agreement, broadly worded, covering anything and everything he'd learned while working for Frank, a severance agreement, terminating his employment immediately, but characterizing it as a mutual parting, a release form, waiving any claims or grievances against Frank or his business entities, and one more thing, less formal, but equally binding, an understanding. an understanding that James would not seek employment in entertainment, politics or media, the industries where Frank operated, an understanding that James would not contact anyone from Frank's circle, an understanding that if asked about his time with Frank, James would say nothing, or if forced to say something, would describe it in the blandest possible terms. I worked briefly as an assistant. It was a professional experience. I have nothing but respect for Mr. Sinatra. The lawyer explained this without emotion. Just terms, just business. James asked one question. What if I don't sign? The lawyer's answer was careful. No threats, no implications of violence. Just, that would be unfortunate for everyone involved, but Mr. Sinatra is confident you'll make the right decision. The weight of that statement was clear. Frank's power didn't require explicit threats. It existed in the atmosphere, in what wasn't said. James signed. He took the money. He took the silence. He took the erasure. And he walked out of that office into a life where he'd never existed. For James, the first few weeks felt like freedom. The money was real. The pressure was gone. He could sleep without wondering if he'd said the wrong thing, heard the wrong thing, become inconvenient. But slowly, quietly, he began to notice changes. A job interview at a production company that had seemed promising suddenly went cold. No explanation, just we decided to go in a different direction. A contact from his pre-Sinatra life, who'd always been friendly, now took days to return calls, then stopped returning them at all. An apartment application in a nice building downtown was rejected despite his financial statements showing he could afford it. The landlord wouldn't say why. These weren't coincidences, they were echoes of power. Frank didn't need to personally make phone calls to destroy James's prospects. The people around Frank, the ones who wanted to stay in Frank's good graces, did it automatically. A subtle word here, a raised eyebrow there. I'd be careful about hiring that guy. I hear Frank isn't happy with him. That was enough. Within 6 months, James had moved to a different city, changed industries entirely, took a job that had nothing to do with entertainment or power or proximity to famous people. He lived quietly, comfortably thanks to the money, but alone, cut off from the world he'd briefly inhabited, and he never spoke Frank Sinatra's name again. For Frank, the immediate aftermath was relief. The risk was managed, the loose thread was cut, the vulnerability was sealed. He continued performing, recording, conquering. The JFK inauguration, more Rat Pack films, more sold-out tours, but something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, just a small corrosion, a quiet wait. Late at night, when the parties ended and the entourage left and Frank was alone in hotel rooms or his Palm Springs compound, he'd think about it sometimes, not with regret exactly. Frank didn't do regret. Regret was weakness, but with awareness. He'd made a man disappear, not with violence, not with cruelty, just with money and influence and the machinery of power. And it had been easy, too easy. That bothered him more than he'd admit, because if it was that easy to erase someone who'd been loyal, who'd done nothing wrong except know too much, what did that say about Frank himself? He sang about loyalty, about friendship, about standing by people. But when it came down to it, when his image was at risk, loyalty became expendable. Frank never mentioned James again, never asked what happened to him, never wondered if the man was okay, because wondering would mean acknowledging what he'd done, and acknowledgement would mean confronting something Frank couldn't afford to confront. That power, unchecked, turns people into functions, into risks to be managed, into problems to be solved, and Frank Sinatra had all the power he needed to solve any problem, even if the problem was a human being. The years passed. The 1960s became the 1970s. The 1970s became the 1980s. Frank's career evolved. He had hits and flops. He retired, then unretired. He married Barbara Marx. He performed with new generations of musicians, and through all of it, no one mentioned James. Not in interviews, not in memoirs. not even in the unauthorized biographies that tried to dig up dirt. The silence held. How? Partly because very few people knew the full story. Frank's world was compartmentalized. The lawyer who handled the paperwork didn't know why James was being paid off. The accountant who processed the payment didn't know the context. The people who'd worked with James just knew he was gone, and partly because silence was the currency of that world. Everyone around Frank had secrets. Everyone had compromises they'd made, things they'd seen that they chose not to talk about. Speaking about James would mean potentially exposing themselves, breaking the code, becoming unreliable, so they stayed quiet. Even after Frank died in 1998, the silence continued. The obituaries were glowing, the tributes were endless, the documentaries analyzed every aspect of his life and career, but James wasn't mentioned, wasn't even a footnote, because history, ultimately, is written by those who have the power to write it. And Frank Sinatra, even in death, had enough residual power to keep certain stories buried. Margaret Dalton, the researcher who first noticed the gap, never solved the mystery. She wrote her oral history without including the unnamed man. There was nothing concrete to include, just a feeling, an absence. But she kept her notes, and sometimes, late in her career, she'd mention it to other researchers, other historians. There was someone, she'd say, someone who was there for a while, then wasn't, and everyone pretended he'd never existed. Most people dismissed it. Hollywood was full of people who came and went, assistants, hangers-on, flavor-of-the-month employees who disappeared when they stopped being useful. But a few people understood what Margaret was really saying, that the absence itself was significant, that erasure is a form of evidence, that what's missing from a story sometimes tells you more than what's included. Frank Sinatra's life has been documented exhaustively. Books, films, academic studies, archival collections, but the gaps, the deliberate gaps, those are where the real truth lives. The people who were paid to forget, the conversations that happened in rooms with no recording devices, the decisions made in lawyers' offices that left no public record. History remembers what power allows it to remember, and Frank Sinatra controlled his story better than almost anyone in entertainment history. So James disappeared, not because he never existed, but because acknowledging his existence would mean acknowledging something uncomfortable about power, control, and the cost of protecting an image, and that acknowledgement was never allowed to happen. To understand Frank Sinatra fully, you have to understand this. He was not a villain. He was a human being who accumulated enormous power and used that power to protect himself. Sometimes protection meant generosity. Frank gave millions to charity, paid for friends' medical bills, supported people who needed help. And sometimes protection meant erasure. When someone became a risk, not through malice, not through betrayal, just through the accident of knowing too much, Frank had the resources to make them disappear quietly. No violence, no drama, just money and silence and the careful application of influence. This wasn't unique to Frank. It's how power works, in Hollywood, in politics, in any world where image is currency and exposure is death. But that doesn't make it right. Because when you erase a person, you're doing something worse than destroying them. You're denying their existence. You're saying you were here, but you don't matter enough to be remembered, and that denial costs something. It costs the person who's erased their sense of identity, their place in history, their validation that what they experienced was real, and it costs the person doing the erasing their humanity, because the ability to make someone vanish without conscience is the ability to see people as objects, as problems, as inconveniences. Frank Sinatra sang about regret for the world, songs about lost love, missed chances, the ache of looking back, one for my baby, in the wee small hours. It was a very good year. Beautiful songs, honest songs, songs that made you feel Frank's pain. But this was the regret he paid never to sing about, the regret of looking at another human being and deciding they could be erased, that their existence could be bargained away. that silence and money could replace the fact that they were real. James, whatever his real name was, existed. He was there. He worked for Frank Sinatra. He knew things. He was part of the story. And then he was made to disappear. Not with violence, not with cruelty, just with power. And somewhere, maybe still alive, maybe gone, that man carries the weight of being forgotten, of being paid to erase himself. That's the cost of protecting an image. That's the price Frank Sinatra paid, not in money, but in the small, quiet corrosion of knowing what he'd done. And that's the price we all pay when we decide that some people matter less than the stories we want to tell about ourselves. Frank Sinatra was many things: genius, icon, legend, but he was also the man who made people disappear. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough that we should remember, enough that the absence itself becomes part of the story, because the people we erase don't stop existing, they just stop being allowed to exist in public. And that difference between erasing someone and making them invisible is everything.